Welcome back to my video series on coding with Flutter. Today we are going to look at different ways of getting access to dependencies in Flutter and what their trade-offs are. We will learn how to make use of InheritedWidget and how it can help as your apps increase in complexity. And really, the message of today's video is to find an answer to a question that is common when building apps. And that question is, how do we get access to the things that we need? For today's lesson, I'll be using an existing project that we have explored earlier in this video series. So if you head over to GitHub at this address, you can find my Firebase Authentication Login Demo. Now, I have updated the source code for this demo for Dart 2, and I also have configured it so that it runs with Firebase on both iOS and Android. So if you want a good starting point to follow along with today's tutorial, I recommend that you check out this specific version of the code, Dart 2, and get the source code from here. One more thing to note is that this project uses Firebase authentication. So to keep things simple, I've bundled the Firebase configuration files in this project so that the code should just compile and run correctly for you. However, do keep in mind that there are some steps required to configure Firebase when you create a new project, and I recommend that you watch my previous Firebase authentication videos to see how this is done. Okay, so before we get started, I want to give you a quick refresher about this Flutter Login Demo. So when we start the app, we see a login screen, and here we can enter an email and a password for an account that we have previously registered with Firebase. And if you tap on the login screen here, it takes us to a welcome screen. From here, we can log out and get back to the login screen. So let's open up our IDE and see how this is done. Okay, so if we look on the project folder over here, we can see that we have a main page, which is where we create our material app. This then creates a root page, which is a widget that we use to alternate between the user being signed in and signed out. So if you will, this gives us control as to what page we show to the user, depending on his authentication status. And then we have a login page, which contains all the logic for managing the email and password of the user and their validation. Inside the login page is where we use our authentication object to sign in the user with email and password. And the authentication object is something of type base auth, which is nothing more than a wrapper for our Firebase authentication API. Additionally, we also have the home page, which is what we use to display the welcome screen that we have seen, and also that's what we use to log out. So it's a fairly simple application, and one thing that we can notice that is common to all these different pages is that they all take this auth parameter as an input. So the root page has a base auth parameter. The login page also has a base auth parameter, and the home page has one as well. And the way these pages receive this auth parameter is that it is injected into their constructor. Now, for clarity, the auth class itself is declared here, and it defines a number of methods that we use to sign in the user, to create a user, get the current user, or sign out. And this has an implementation with a class called auth, which implements this base abstract class. And what this does is actually call into the Firebase authentication APIs. So we can see this as a wrapper to our Firebase methods. And one thing that I talked about when I was building this project in the previous video lessons was that at some point we were accessing directly the Firebase instance within our login page and making directly the call to authenticate the user. And what we said back then was that perhaps it's a better idea to not use directly the Firebase calls up here and abstract them away into a separate auth object. So this is what we have done with this class over here. Okay, so if we take a look at a diagram that represents our widget hierarchy, it looks something like this. So at the root level, we have an app widget, which injects an authentication object to our root page. And the root page also gives this very same object to the login and to the home pages. And we can actually see this in the code. So at the root level, we create a root page and we give it an auth object. And then the root page itself decides to show the login page and passes along this authentication object. Now the widget tree in our example is still relatively simple. However, we can try to imagine what would happen if we had a more nested hierarchy. So for example, if any of the widgets on the tree needed access to the auth object, we would have to find a way to pass it to them. So in this example, we would have a root widget, which then creates a widget A, which creates widget B, and finally widget B would create the login page. Now, if the login page, like in our case, needs the auth object, there must be a way for the widget B to pass it to the login page. And so here really we are highlighting a problem, and that is that passing dependencies around can become hard to maintain as our application grows. And so let's stop for a second and take a step back. What if there was a way to say that a certain dependency is accessible to an entire portion of our widget tree? In other words, is there a way that we can hold a reference to our dependency somewhere in our widget tree and make it accessible to other widgets without directly injecting it? So let's take a look at a different approach. And what I have here is an AuthProvider, which is essentially a widget that holds a reference to our auth object. And I need a way for all the widgets below it to be able to access this auth object. Now in Flutter, this is done with a widget called InheritedWidget, and this is what we will focus on for the rest of this video. So what I'm going to show you next is how we can create our own inherited widgets and how to use them to access dependencies from within our widget tree. One thing that I want to mention is that you might already have been using inherited widgets in the code without knowing it. So for example, here we could write something like theme of context dot primary color, and what this does is gets access to the theme object that is defined in our material app at the root of the widget tree and gets access to the primary color. So today we're going to clarify what this syntax means, and we're going to see why it's something that is very useful in Flutter and how you can use it yourself. So let's clear this up. And we are now ready to start writing some code. So let's add a new file to our project called AuthProvider Dart. And let's start writing some code. So what we want to create is a new class called AuthProvider. And this is going to extend from InheritedWidget. Now we need to import this class so that it's available to us on this file. And now we can see that the compiler is flagging us an error here that we are missing an implementation for update should notify. So this is a method that we are required to implement whenever we use an inherited widget. So let's add an implementation for that. Okay, so what is this method for? The documentation says that when this widget is rebuilt, it tells the framework whether we need to rebuild the widgets that inherit from it. So for this example, we're just going to return true. However, depending on the use case, you might have some logic in here to return true or false. So I encourage you to look up the documentation for update should notify. Okay, so we're ready to move on, and the next thing that we want to do is to create something that will give us access to the AuthProvider. So let's create a method which is going to be static, and this will return AuthProvider, and it's gonna be called auth with build context of context. And what we're doing here is return a context dot inherit from widget of exact type. Make sure that you write this correctly. And then the type that we're looking for is AuthProvider. One last thing that we need in order for this to compile is to specify here as AuthProvider. So let's break down what we have just done here. We created a method which is a static method, and that means that anywhere in our code we will be able to say AuthProvider of and pass the context. And what this does is from the context it tries to find a widget that matches the type AuthProvider. And here we're just casting to AuthProvider, and the reason for that is that the method itself returns type AuthProvider, but this inherit from widget of exact type just returns a widget. So we need a cast here just to tell the compiler, hey, yes, this is the type that we want. Now, because we will be hooking up our AuthProvider somewhere, it will need to have a child, which is something that is very commonplace in Flutter. So we need to give a way to the AuthProvider to specify a child. So let's do that, and what we're doing here is AuthProvider, and we define a constructor. We specify actually a key as well as a child, so widget child. And what we're going to do here is just call super by passing on the key, which is going to be key, and then the child, which is a child. So we're all good. And there is one more thing that we need to do. Nowhere in this class we specify that this AuthProvider has an auth object, which really is what we need in order to perform our authentication calls. So let's add that as well. So we're going to say final base auth of auth, and we need to remember to import this file from our project. And just to make things configurable, we're going to say that this is actually going to be given as a parameter to the AuthProvider class itself. Okay, so now our AuthProvider class is complete, and if we wanted to use it in our code, because of the way we have defined it, we will be able to write something like AuthProvider.of context, and then get access to the auth object that we have defined here. So this is exactly what we want. Now, before we can do that, we actually need to put the AuthProvider somewhere in our widget tree. And if you remember the diagram that I showed you, what we had here was the AuthProvider sitting at the top of the widget hierarchy. So let's do that and add it to our main file. So in here is where we return our material app. What we are going to do is to wrap this with a new widget, and here we're going to say AuthProvider like this. We need to remember to import it so that it's accessible from here, and there you go. So it specifies a child, which is now our material app, and we also need to pass an auth parameter, which is going to be auth. Notice how this same auth parameter was also passed on to the root page. Now, passing the auth parameter to the root page is something that is no longer necessary because we now have this AuthProvider. And in fact, what we want to do now is actually remove this auth parameter from not just the root page, but also the login page. So we're going to do this and take it away from here. And we also remove it from the home page. And this is actually reflecting what we had said we would do in the diagram. So if you remember here, we're going to have the AuthProvider with the auth object on top, and all the remaining widgets don't really have auth injected directly to them. So our code now will not compile, and the next thing that we're going to do is to actually fix all the places where the pages are created, and whenever we need access to the auth object, we need to access it through the AuthProvider that we have created. So for the root page, we need to replace this widget.auth.currentUser with the AuthProvider. Now, one thing that I need to clarify about how we access this type of thing is here we could write AuthProvider of context.auth. So that's actually what we want to write. However, we need to be careful that if we look at the implementation of inherited from widget of exact type, we will find out that this is something that we are not meant to be calling directly from the init state method, and instead we should use did change dependencies. So let's actually do that, and we're going to implement this did change dependencies method, which we are going to override, and we're going to say void super.did change dependencies, and we want to move all the authentication code that we had in here into this new method. So very important to remember, let me just complete this. Very important to remember that whenever you use InheritedWidget, it's okay to use it within the build method or methods that are called by the build method. It's not okay to call it from init state, because at that stage the object is not fully initialized. So if you need an alternative to init state, you can use did change dependencies. So this is what we have done here. Very important. And now we can see how things are going to change. So we used to pass the auth object directly to the login page and to the home page, but now these two pages no longer take that parameter, so we can remove it from here. And this fixes our root page. We can now move on to the login page and also check what errors we have. So again, here we were using widget.auth.signin with email and password, and instead what we want to do now is to say var auth, which is AuthProvider.context.auth. And obviously we need to remember to import it. And now that we have the auth object, we simply use it directly here. And this fixes our login page as well. The last thing that we want to do is go to the home page, and once again we have a method here to sign out, but we no longer have access to auth. So what we do is to say var auth equals AuthProvider .of context.auth, and we import it. We see that now we have a little problem here, in that the sign out method actually doesn't pass the build context, so we can't really call this method like this, and so we need to supply a build context to the sign out method, and this will make things work for us. And because the signature of the sign out method has now changed as well, we need to remember to update the callback point here. So we're going to say callback with sign out of context. So this should make it work. This is still complaining, so let's import AuthProvider, and now our homepage works as well. At this stage, all the code has been fixed, so we have just hot reloaded the application, and let's just check that everything still works. So we can say test at test.com and insert a password and try to log in, and we can see that the functionality is still working as it was before. Okay, so now that we have converted our project to use InheritedWidget, let's do a quick recap of what we have seen today. So we have explored constructor dependency injection as a direct way of configuring our classes with the dependencies that they need. We have seen some of the disadvantages of using this approach, especially as our widget tree grows in size. We have then explored an alternative solution which uses InheritedWidget And how we have seen how we can use this to make our dependencies available to an entire widget tree. And we have seen how to implement our own AuthProvider using InheritedWidget. And we have converted our login demo project to use AuthProvider. In the process of doing so, we have learned a couple of rules about InheritedWidget, and specifically how it should not be used inside init state, but it should be used with did change dependencies instead. And because InheritedWidget needs a context to do its own magic, then we need to make our context accessible in our widgets, especially if they are stateless. One final thing that I would like to say about InheritedWidget is that this is already used quite a lot within the Flutter framework itself, and I've shown how we can use it, for example, to access the theme data from any widget in our widget tree. And this is also the kind of underlying technology that is used by a number of third-party libraries for state management. So if you look under the covers of libraries such as Scoped Model or Redux as well, you will see that the Dart implementation for those libraries actually uses InheritedWidget under the hood. So it is definitely something that works really well in Flutter, and I encourage you to consider it as you scale your applications and you're looking for a solution to solve your dependency injection problems. And just to be clear, InheritedWidget is just one possible tool that you can use to solve dependency injection or state management in your applications. And there are other tools that are viable and might work better in your use case. We have seen constructor dependency injection. You can use global state to access things from anywhere if you want less boilerplate code. And there are other solutions such as service locators and other things that the community is coming up with. So this is an area that is still very much active, and there will be maybe new solutions coming up in the future. So again, I just encourage you to see InheritedWidget as a tool and evaluate whether that tool is right for the job at hand. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope you have enjoyed this demo. If you want to check out the latest code, which includes the new AuthProvider implementation that we've written today, you can just check out the latest from this project on GitHub over here. And as usual, if you want to follow up on the next videos and articles, make sure to sign up on Coding with Flutter, and I'll be publishing more in the coming weeks. So thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you on the next videos.